Sometimes, we tend to cherry-pick facts to fit our narratives, but when it comes to the Battle of Little Bighorn, that's a dangerous game. The events of that fateful day, June 25, 1876, are often subject to speculation. The precise timing of the 7th Cavalry's movements, such as when they left Busby Camp or arrived at Halt 1, are crucial because every minute influenced later actions. Whether Custer stayed with his men or rushed ahead on his own is still debated, as this decision had cascading effects. Timing, which wasn't as crucial during the battle itself, has become one of the focal points of later analyses. To be fair and balanced, we must include differing perspectives, even if they don't always support the favored narrative. It's a puzzle where conflicting accounts require us to sift through and identify the truth. Among those offering valuable insight, George Herendine, Fred Gerard, Luke Hare, Charles Varnum, Edward Godfrey, and Win Edgerly. Enlisted soldiers like First Sergeant John Ryan, Sergeant Ferdin and Culbertson, and Private Charles Windolf also played significant roles. Less reliable but still part of the historical record are voices like William Morris, Peter Thompson, and Theodore Golden, the latter being notorious for embellishments. Lieutenant Carlos Duroy, while often detailed, requires careful consideration because his stories sometimes waver between truth and self-preservation. Fred Bentini remains a controversial figure, polarizing opinions due to his role in the battle. While many disregard his contributions, I believe Bentini's perspective adds a complex layer to the event. Historians, like Fred Dustin, however, were highly skeptical of some accounts, particularly those of Frederick F. Gerard, but I don't entirely agree. Frederick Gerard, the enigmatic interpreter for the Arikara Scouts, was a fascinating figure, despite being one of the oldest men on the campaign. At 46, his skills as a frontiersman are often questioned. Historian James Willard painted Gerard as impulsive and lacking experience in Indian warfare, even though his life was filled with adventure. Willard also controversially claimed that Gerard's report to Custer about the Indians not fleeing was one of the key factors leading to Custer's defeat. It's a bold statement but surprisingly accurate, considering the uncertain timeline of observations. At a critical moment, Gerard's report took precedence, even over that of seasoned scouts. Gerard's background is as compelling as his role in the battle. Born in St. Louis, Missouri on November 14, 1829, he ventured westward in 1848, eventually securing a job at Fort Pierre with the American Fur Company. By 1855, he had moved to Fort Berthold, where he witnessed fierce battles, including a Christmas Day siege in 1863 when 600 Sioux attacked. Gerard, alongside 17 men, held off the attackers until friendly forces arrived, though he spent an additional 10 days alone, ready to blow up the post if the Sioux returned. Sitting Buell himself took Gerard's black stallion in a bold move that cemented the tension between them. Gerard's career continued to evolve. In 1872, he became a post interpreter at Fort Abraham Lincoln. His quick thinking in 1873 saved a surveying party led by Rosser, an old friend of George Custer, from an ambush by hostile Indians. However, not everyone appreciated Gerard's skills. Marcus Reno in particular had serious issues with him, even going so far as to have dismissed from the fort. Their mutual disdain spilled into Reno's post-battle comments. Despite Reno's criticisms, Gerard proved to be a capable frontiersman, and his record defies the negative portrayal painted by Willard. He wasn't as inexperienced as some would claim. In fact, just days before the campaign began in May 1876, Gerard enlisted as the interpreter for the Arikawa Scouts. Interestingly, while Gerard may have had an inflated sense of his own abilities, his contributions were highly valued by some, including General Terry. After the battle, when Gerard returned to Fort Lincoln, Terry publicly praised him for his early assessments of the Indian forces, according to Charles Varnum. Terry even wrote a letter to Gerard expressing his regret for not heeding his warnings sooner. Despite Gerard's occasional self-promotion, this endorsement speaks volumes about his importance during the campaign. When the 7th Cavalry departed from Halt 1, it's uncertain whether George Custer left with his regiment, fully aware they were trailing him, or if he left ahead of them without realizing they had started moving, despite the generally understood order for an 8 o'clock departure. Herendine, a scout, believed everyone left simultaneously. In a newspaper interview given nearly 2 weeks after the battle, he recalled shortly after dawn, the scouts informed Custer that they had spotted the village from the top of the divide. According to Herendine, the command advanced up the creek until they reached its head, then diverted into a ravine for cover. This location was about 3 miles from where we were, near the head of the creek to the top of the divide, where the Indian scouts claimed the village could be seen. After positioning the command in the ravine, Custer took a few orderlies and rode ahead to see for himself. He remained away for about an hour and upon returning, claimed he could not see the village. However, the scouts warned him that the regiment had been spotted and word was being sent back to the Sioux village. Herendine's account, given in a second article 1.5 years later, adds further detail. He stated that, after leaving Busby Camp on the night of June 24th, the regiment traveled roughly 10 miles, although in reality, the distance was closer to 6.5, and made camp around 2 a.m. Once the scouts reported the Indian camp's location to Custer, the regiment moved forward. At first, light herending continued. Around 9 o'clock, Custer halted his troops and hid them as best he could. At this point, Custer took one orderly and headed toward the divide, which was only about 4 miles away, though in fact, the distance was less than a mile from this second halt. Varney and Boyer were already at the divide when Custer arrived, and he stayed there for 1 to 1.2 hours. Vernon's account also adds complexity. He wrote that the column reached the trail crossing of the divide at about 10 a.m., at which point Custer joined him. Vernon rode out to meet him, and together they climbed a bluff where the Indians tried to point out what they could see. But in a letter written years earlier in 1990 to Walter Camp, Varholm described a slightly different scenario. After viewing the Little Bighorn Valley and spotting some Sioux, Varholm set out to intercept and engage them. After dispatching some scouts, Boyer, Reynolds, and 2 Crows, along with Varnum himself, began a dismounted trek through rugged terrain. Varnum heard a strange call halting them, and shortly afterward, they saw Sioux change their path and cross a ridge, disappearing toward the command. At that moment, they noticed Custer's columns, stirring up dust as they moved. But the Sioux had already spotted them. Varholm rode back down to meet the column, where Custer greeted him saying, "Well, you've had quite a night." Varholm confirmed this with a remark about still being able to observe the situation despite the long night. Custer's brother Tom and Calhoun approached, only for Custer to scold them for leaving the column. After reporting all he had seen, Varnum and Custer climbed Crownest Hill, with Custer listening closely to Boyer while studying the valley. Fred Gerard, however, had a slightly different perspective. Testifying at the Reno Inquiry in 1879, 30 years before Varholm's 1909 letter, Gerard recalled that when the command halted at Davis Creek, the first halt orders were given to make coffee, with small fires which were to be extinguished once the coffee was ready. The horses were to remain saddled, and they were to camp after daylight. After his coffee, Gerard slept, only to be awakened by Custer, who instructed him to take to scouts and accompany him to the lookout. Either Cook or Tom Custer approached the general, asking if the command should move, but Custer's reply was clear: "No. You will stay here until I return." The group then rode to the base of the mountain, where they dismounted and continued on foot to the peak, where they found Varnum, Boyer, and Bloody Knife. During this time, Gerard remained with Custer, and no orders were issued to move the command. Yet upon their return, they discovered the troops had moved about 3 miles closer. When Custer asked who had ordered the movement, Tom Custer responded, "I don't know. The orders were to march, and so we did." Gerard, unlike others, remained consistent in his recollections over the years. He repeated his story to camp in 1909, noting that Custer explicitly told his brother not to move the troops until further notice. They had camped in a narrow valley east of the divide, and Custer had taken Gerard and 2 scouts to a high point where they observed a large pony herd and clouds of dust indicating movement, confirming that the Sioux had been driving their horses. This was early morning, after the night march of June 24th. The horses remained saddled, and scouts soon arrived with news that a large camp had been located and that the Sioux had become aware of their presence. By the time the Arakawa narrative was published in 1920, based on accounts gathered before Gerard's death, in 1930 his story remained unchanged. After the night march, the men slept on the ground, and Tari scouts brought a message, confirming the sighting of the large camp. Gerard Custer and several scouts rode to meet Varnum at daybreak, where they saw a massive movement and a cloud of dust. Custer left the lookout at a quick pace to rejoin the command and admonished his brother for allowing the troops to move. Ultimately, what we have here is a minor sequence of events, remembered differently by those involved. Fred Gerard, however, never wavered in his version of the story, despite minor adjustments in detail. Of those who accompanied Custer from the first halt to Crow's Nest, only Gerard and Red Star survived the battle. While the debate over whether Custer scolded his brother once or twice may seem trivial, the key takeaway is clear. Custer led the regiment to Crow's Nest and observed the valley before his men arrived. By the time the command halted a second time, Custer had already scouted the area and was preparing for the next phase of action. It seems improbable that Custer would have taken more than 2 hours to reach his goal, reinforcing the notion that he was well ahead of his men, positioning himself for the upcoming engagement.